The last we left Joseph Smith, he, his brother Hiram Smith, Porter Rockwell, and Willard Richards were paddling across the Mississippi River in the dark of the night. And Joseph, Hiram, and Willard each have one of their boots off and are bailing out the leaky boat as Porter paddles them along. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. By the time Joseph and his travel partners get across the Mississippi River, the sun has started to come up. But they've escaped from the authority of Governor Ford, and they're in Iowa. And Joseph tells everyone again that the mobs and apostates only want to kill him, Joseph. He tells them that the Lord has shown him what to do, and that if Joseph leaves and goes into hiding, that soon all the conflict will die down, and the mobs will quiet down, and all the people of Nauvoo will be safe. Now back in Nauvoo, John Taylor wakes up and learns that Joseph is gone, and John is terrified. He starts to pack up all his notes, his books and papers. He tells his wife that he has to go to Canada to keep safe. Not to keep himself safe, but the church documents and the writings of the prophet. Well, across town there's a knock at Emma Smith's door, and she opens it up to see a posse of 20 men who have come to arrest Joseph and escort him to Carthage. And she tells the posse that her husband isn't there, and they go into the house and search the property just to be sure that he isn't hiding in any back rooms. And after they're certain that he isn't at home, they go back to Carthage to report to Governor Ford, but they leave behind one of the men to keep an eye on the property and look out for Joseph just in case he decides to come back. But Joseph isn't planning on coming back. He's planning on going with Hiram further out west, over the Rocky Mountains. Joseph has decided that he is going to go out west and find a place which the Latter-day Saints can settle, somewhere far away from anyone else so that there's no persecution, so his new little church can have a few moments of peace, time to grow and put down roots. And Joseph's hoping by the time that he and his brother get back to Nauvoo that the mob will have calmed down to the point that he can leave with settlers back out west. Now, this idea to go out west didn't come out of nowhere. Joseph had been thinking about it for a while. 2 years earlier, Joseph was having a conversation with some of the brethren of the church, and this is in the summer of 1842. And Joseph and the brethren were talking about the history of their persecutions in Missouri, and what Joseph called the constant annoyance which had followed them into Illinois. Well, at this point in 1842, the persecution in Nauvoo had not yet reached the fever pitch that it's currently at. But back in 1842, as they're recounting this constant annoyance, Joseph prophesied that the saints would continue to suffer much affliction and would eventually be driven to the Rocky Mountains. Joseph prophesied that many of the members would apostatize or leave the church and stop believing his teachings, and he prophesied others would be put to death by the church's persecutors. And Joseph prophesied that the saints would make settlements and build cities and become a mighty people in the midst of the Rocky Mountains. So leaving Nauvoo for the Rocky Mountains is something that Joseph had on his mind for at least 2 years, but he's been thinking about it recently too. The night that Joseph met the two boys crawling on the banks of the Mississippi River, after they had been sent as spies to William Law's secret meeting. We talked about that back in episode 2. Well, there on the riverbank, he told those boys there that he was probably going to have to go to the Rocky Mountains. And even just earlier in the day, he had been talking about it. In the last episode, we talked about how Joseph was walking down by the Mississippi River with his bodyguard, Stephen Markham, while they waited for John Taylor and Dr. Burneisel to get back from speaking with Governor Ford, and how there's the 300 guards that are all around all the way up to the house. Well, even in that conversation, before they got the letter back from Governor Ford, telling him that he must go to Carthage for court, Joseph tells Stephen Markham that he's probably going to leave soon for the Rocky Mountains. So this idea to leave for the Rocky Mountains might seem like it came out of nowhere, but it had been in Joseph's mind for a long time. The only part of it that probably came as a surprise was that he decided to leave right then and there without notice or preparation. And so Joseph and his brother Hiram and Willard Richards are hiding out in the house of one of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who lives in Iowa. And this becomes their base camp, their jumping off point to travel out west. And so after they cross the river, Porter Rockwell goes back to Nauvoo to tell Emma where Joseph is going and to get some horses for Joseph and Hiram for their trip. Porter also goes back to suggest to Emma that she should go back east to Portsmouth, Ohio, to lay low for a while. So Porter gets back and is talking to Emma, and Stephen Markham is there too, and in comes Reynolds Cahoon. You'll remember him from the night prior. He was the man that was sent down to guard the gate and momentarily kept Secretary of State Calhoun's sons from meeting with the prophet. Well, Reynolds has heard the prophet has left, and he's furious, and he's come to talk to Emma about it. Reynolds and some other church members who have come to visit Emma with him are tired of running. They, like most of the early converts to the religion, were driven from Ohio to Missouri and from Missouri to Illinois, and all the while they're having their property and land stolen from them. They tell Emma that they do not want to leave again. They do not want to leave their property and land behind anymore. These men had reached their breaking points. Now, Stephen and Porter, who were there listening to Reynolds' complaints, are angry with him and the other men for not supporting Joseph. Stephen tells Reynolds to mind his own business and let Joseph alone. He tells the brethren that Joseph has left him with specific orders and that he will die before he varies from them. Porter, too, angrily tells Reynolds that he will always throw in his lot with Joseph and that he can't be expected to try and help Reynolds convince Joseph to stay. Reynolds and the men, however, convince Emma to write a letter to Joseph, and in the letter, Emma asks her husband to come back to Nauvoo. And so then Reynolds and the other men, they all go into Iowa to speak with Joseph. Reynolds brings Emma's letter with him, and Porter goes along too. They get to the house Joseph is hiding in, and they go back to a room to find him and Hiram and Willard sitting on the floor packing burlap bags to go out west. They're scooping in beans and cornmeal and all the provisions they might need for their trip into these burlap bags. To me, this is an amazing moment. The man who is the mayor of the largest city in Illinois, the general of the state's largest militia, a presidential candidate, and the prophet of a growing religion who talks with God, is sitting on a floor in an empty room, scooping beans into a burlap sack, getting ready to flee into the wilderness. This must have been quite the sight for the men who were there with him. Reynolds comes into the room and tells Joseph that the governor, earlier that morning, had sent in his posse to arrest him and bring Joseph back to Carthage. Reynolds tells Joseph that if he does not come back, that they'll lay siege around the city until he does. Joseph, repeating his earlier claim, tells Reynolds that even if they do lay the city to siege, they will not do it forever, and that they will not harm any of the citizens. Joseph tells Reynolds that they are only after himself and Hiram, and that if they both leave, the anger of the mob will soon melt and they will be distracted by other things. And this infuriates Reynolds. He tells Joseph that if he leaves Nauvoo, the mob won't actually have their anger abated, but instead all of their property will once again be destroyed and they will be left without house or home. Reynolds gives Joseph Emma's letter, and Joseph reads it, but even the letter from his wife doesn't dissuade him from leaving. Joseph tells Reynolds that he knows his own business and gives the letter to Hiram to read. Reynolds then calls Joseph Smith a coward. He says, quote, "It is true. When the wolves come, the shepherd runs from the flock, leaving the sheep to be devoured." End quote. This hit Joseph hard. We talked about Brigham Young standing up for Joseph Smith in Kirtland when everyone else around him was claiming Joseph was a fallen prophet. Brigham was one of the men in Kirtland who would not. We talked about Orson Hyde and Thomas B. Marsh, apostles who left the church in Missouri. And even though they both ended up coming back, they co-signed an affidavit that ended up helping get Joseph put in jail for 6 months. And most recently, we've talked about William Law, one of the other two men who, along with Joseph, formed the highest governing body of the restored Church of Jesus Christ, who was now actively seeking to kill him. Many other leaders of the church, Joseph's close friends, had left over the last 14 years of Joseph's life. I think it was so much for Joseph. And when I think of Joseph Smith, especially in this moment, on the floor scooping beans into a burlap bag, I think of the loneliness of leadership. He was the prophet of God. He was the one direct link between God and man, and he was rejected over and over again. His friends have come to him and told him to walk back to what he insists is his death. The term, like we mentioned in the last episode, strangers and pilgrims, comes from the Bible. It's used to refer to prophets from the Old Testament who spent their whole lives trying to serve God and not man, trying to learn the will of God and to follow his will. And because God's ways are not man's ways, as these Old Testament prophets went around following God's will, they became strangers to society and pilgrims on the earth. The prophets are people that are in the world but not of the world. And shortly before his death, referring to these kinds of people, Jesus explained to his apostles that the world hated them because they were not of the world. And because they're hated, strangers and pilgrims suffer great trials. They're mocked, they're beaten, they're put in prisons, and a lot of them are ultimately killed. Their heads are cut off, they're thrown into fires, they're executed. And I think it's easy to look back at it now and say, well, of course you had to go through the hard parts, but look at all the good things that came out of it. And that's hard. In the moment it's happening, the persecutions and struggles that strangers and pilgrims go through are real. And I think at this moment, Joseph is sad and lonely. It's the loneliness of leadership. He's leaving to find a place for his persecuted people to flee to. He's looking for support from the members of his church. He's looking for them to trust him and follow him. And he had followers, Porter and Stephen and Brigham. And to be fair, even these men who are now opposing him had, for the last 14 years, from state to state, through all sorts of persecutions and trials, followed him. But I think these men just hit their breaking point, and there was a trial of faith for a lot of people. The city's under martial law. Mobs and militias in Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa are all starting to take up arms, and so here they come feeling like what the prophet is doing is actually running away. In the Old Testament, Moses, the prophet, frees his people, the Israelites, from bondage. Through the story, through a series of miracles, the Lord, through Moses, helps the Israelites escape from Egypt, where they had been slaves, and he leads them through the wilderness to a promised land. The scriptures say that God led them with a pillar of a cloud in the morning and a pillar of fire by night. The Lord, while these people are traveling around in the wilderness, feeds them with manna from heaven. Manna falls from the sky on a nightly basis, and the Israelites in the morning gather this manna to eat. It's a miracle that it's there. They have nothing else to eat as they're traveling around in the wilderness. And this manna literally gives them life. And what do the freed slaves do about it? They complain. They complain that manna isn't meat. They say, in Egypt, when we were slaves, we ate fish and cucumbers, melons, onions, and garlic. We had meat. Here we have nothing but manna. They say that it would have been better if they had just been kept as slaves back in Egypt. They tell the man who freed them, Moses, and the men who represents God that freed them, that they'd just rather be slaves. And at night they sit in their tents and they cry because they're sad that they only have manna to eat. And so Moses sits in his tent at night and listens to these people he's saved and says, please God, kill me. Please, I cannot do this alone. That's the loneliness of leadership. That's what it means to be a stranger and a pilgrim. It means that even your followers sometimes choose not to follow you. I think Joseph, as a prophet of God and the leader of people, must have gone through similar feelings as Moses did. And Joseph has just been called scared by some of his followers as he sits in the room, packing his sack to head out west. And Hiram finishes reading Joseph's letter from Emma. Joseph asks his brother what they should do. Well, Hiram says, quote, let us go back and give ourselves up and see the thing out, end quote. And Joseph tells Hiram, if you go back, I will go with you, but we shall be butchered. And Joseph and his friends cross back over the river and get to Nauvoo at 5:30 in the evening. Hiram's 5-year-old son, Joseph F. Smith, is standing there waiting for them as they cross back. He is excited to see his father. Joseph F. Smith was born in the middle of the Latter-day Saints' persecution in Missouri. He was born 2 weeks after his father Hiram was taken into prison along with his uncle Joseph. The first time his father saw him was when Joseph F. was brought by his mother to Liberty Jail to visit him. From there, little Joseph F. Smith crossed into Illinois into the middle of winter with his mother, probably in a similar fashion to how his aunt, Emma, crossed into Illinois over the frozen Mississippi River. This little 5-year-old boy has known persecution most of his life. As they get back to Nauvoo, Joseph stops Porter, who has been walking close to the prophet the whole way back. And Joseph says to Porter, quote, I want you to promise me that you will not go to Carthage jail at all, end quote. Joseph knew how loyal Porter was to him. He knew how much Porter loved him. And Joseph did not want him to go along to Carthage, because he knew that if he went, he would not leave Joseph's side. We can only assume that Joseph thought it would mean Porter would also die, in the same way that Joseph told Wilford Woodruff, one of the members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, that if he did not leave to electioneer for his presidential campaign, that Wilford would be killed. So Joseph made Porter promise that he would stay in Nauvoo, and so Porter did. Or so Porter would. Well, as they get home, their families are there waiting for them. They're all happy to see their husbands return. And Hiram gets home and sees his daughter Lovina and her boyfriend together. And he asks her, as any dad might say, when are you going to be married? And Lovina admits that they want to be married, but tells her dad that they're waiting for him to do it. So whenever he has the time to marry them, they will. Hiram tells her that it will have to be today because he does not know that he will ever have another time to marry them. So Hiram shaves and changes into some nicer clothes for the wedding, and while he does, Joseph plays with his young nephew, Joseph F. Smith, for a while. And that evening, maybe into the night, they have a wedding, and Hiram officiates it. It must have been an emotional event for the bride's uncle, being surrounded by people, happy to see him back home, happy to see Lavina married, and all the while certain that he's heading towards his own death. And the next morning, early in the morning, Governor Ford's posse is back at Joseph Smith's house to take him to Carthage. The posse is there to force Joseph Smith to go to Carthage, but also to protect him on the way there. Because you remember in the governor's meeting with John Taylor and Dr. Burneisel that he promised them that he would protect Joseph to Carthage, or protect Joseph getting to Carthage. Outside the house, Joseph kisses each of his children goodbye and walks off through his house's gate to join the other men who would go with him to Carthage. They left on horseback. In the party were Willard Richards, John Taylor, who had not yet run off to Canada before Joseph made it back to Nauvoo. Joseph's bodyguard, Stephen Markham, was there, and some others. Well, as they leave the city, they stop and say goodbye to people, and Joseph stops at one man's house and calls on him, a man named Daniel H. Wells. Daniel Wells was not a member of the church. In fact, he had lived in Nauvoo before the Latter-day Saints ever showed up there. He lived in the Nauvoo area back when it was called Commerce. Daniel H. Wells, Esquire, was a justice of the peace in Hancock County. And back in episode 4, we talked about how, after the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor, Joseph went to court twice, while Judge Wells was the judge at Joseph's second trial. Joseph stops on his way out of town to visit Judge Wells. They had served together as leaders in the Nauvoo Legion, and had been friends outside of that. Joseph grabs Daniel by the hand and says, quote, "I wish you to cherish my memory, and not think me the worst man in the world either," end quote. On top of the hill in Nauvoo was a religious building important to members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Nauvoo Temple. As this party passes by the temple, Joseph stops to look back over the cities leaving behind. Now, the Nauvoo Temple at the time is under construction. It's only half of a limestone shell, the outside of the building, and it's covered in scaffolding. But even under construction, the temple is a significant building. It is a central part of the Latter-day Saints settlement in Nauvoo, as other temples were in previous Latter-day Saint settlements, and the temple is a central part of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. The temple was a special meeting house, the house of the Lord, a place where God and angels could come and visit men, and a place where men and women could go and fast and pray and receive special direction and revelation for their lives. The first temple of God in this generation was built in Kirtland, Ohio, 8 years before Joseph Smith was killed. Joseph was commanded by God in a revelation to build the temple. It took Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints 4 years to build that temple. For 4 years, these financially poor Latter-day Saints in Kirtland, Ohio, worked all day long in the temple with their own hands, and Joseph Smith was foreman of the quarry where the stone for the temple walls were cut. And Joseph's wife, Emma, oversaw all the women's sewing clothes for the men in building the temple. And while the temple was being built in Ohio from 1832 to 1836, church members would often work all day in the temple and then stay up all night guarding the temple with their guns, having to protect it from mobs who were trying to destroy it. Even back then, mobs were regularly out trying to hurt the Latter-day Saints and destroy the temple. Even in Ohio, Joseph Smith had a personal bodyguard day and night to protect him from mobs trying to kill him. Now, the Kirtland Temple was built so that the Lord and other heavenly angels would have a place to come and visit with the saints. So after the building was finished, it was dedicated, and on the day it was dedicated, quote, "a noise was heard like the sound of a rushing mighty wind," end quote. It filled the temple. The room was filled with angels, and there were many manifestations of the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Holy Spirit, like the Apostle Paul talked about in the Bible. Well, a week later, after the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, other heavenly visitors came to see Joseph Smith there. Jesus appeared to him, Moses, Elias, and Elijah from the Bible came. But 2 years after that temple in Kirtland is built, Joseph Smith is driven out of Ohio. We talked in the last episode about how he was run out of town on a horse, and his wife followed closely behind with their children in the wagon the next day. And Joseph moves to the Latter-day Saint settlement of Far West, Missouri. He escaped from Kirtland in January. 2 months later, he gets to Far West, Missouri, and he receives a commandment from the Lord that a temple is going to be built there. In July of 1838, on the 4th of July, actually, the cornerstones of the Far West Temple were laid. Pertinent to our story, actually, at that cornerstone ceremony, Sidney Rigdon, remember Sidney Rigdon is the other man in the church's first presidency, the church's highest governing body, We haven't talked a lot about him in this story, but at the cornerstone ceremony on the 4th of July in far west Missouri, Sidney Rigdon gave a riotous speech known as the Salt Sermon. We don't have a record of the speech, but it was based on part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, the part where Jesus said, quote, "Ye are the salt of the earth. If the salt hath lost its savor, it is thenceforth good for nothing, to be cast out and trodden under the feet of men. But to be cast out and trodden under the feet of men," end quote. And in his speech, essentially, Sidney takes that principle and draws it out. He equates the men and women in the church who no longer believed in Joseph Smith or his teachings to salt that was no longer salty and so wasn't worth anything but to be thrown on the ground and stepped on. And this speech caused the Latter-day Saints to start to weed out their own members who no longer believed, and a lot of the members were excommunicated from the church. A lot of leaders, actually, are excommunicated too. And this speech also encouraged some to, instead of being at the receiving end of persecution, to start to fight back, to fight the mobs. So this speech kind of starts to escalate the tensions between the Latter-day Saints and the mobs in Missouri, and it ends up with what we have talked about: fights, murders, rapes, robberies, the massacre at Hansmel, and finally the governor's extermination order, Joseph being taken from the city in chains. Now the temple in Far West was never built. The 4 cornerstones, however, are left behind. Another temple was never built in Missouri also, this one in Independence, the city where Porter Rockwell sat in jail at the beginning of our story. That one had cornerstones laid, but the Latter-day Saints were also ran out of town before they could start construction. So the Latter-day Saints now living in Nauvoo have been chased away from 3 temples, 1 in Ohio, 2 in Missouri, and now they're building a 4th in Nauvoo. And just like in Kirtland, a lot of the daily lives of the saints here involve building the temple, constructing the temple. It's a central activity to their lives. And at the time, men either worked on site building it or at the quarry cutting stones. The men and women worked every 10 days as a tithing of their labor. So sitting on horseback looking out over the city of Nauvoo, Joseph is standing in front of this great symbol. It symbolizes their commitment to practice their religion. It represents their revelations and their connection to heaven. It represents a sacrifice of their time and their money, and it represents their refusal to give in to the mobs. Because just as the mobs keep driving them away from their temples, the Latter-day Saint refugees keep resettling and rebuilding new ones. As Joseph sits on his horse next to this temple, he looks out over the city and says, quote, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens. Little do they know the trials that await them," end quote. Joseph and other church leaders and Governor Ford's posse make it a few miles down the road when they are stopped by a leader in the state militia with a large body of men on horseback. Seeing the large crowd and fearing that they are going to be killed right there, John Taylor asks Joseph, quote, "Will we not even make it to Carthage?" End quote. And Joseph in response tells John, quote, "Do not be alarmed, they can only kill the body," end quote. The leader of this militia group rides up to Joseph, the leader of the Nauvoo militia, and tells him that he has an order from Governor Ford for the surrender of all the state arms in possession of the Nauvoo Legion. They're there to take the guns of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, they're not taking personal guns, they're just taking the state-issued militia weapons. And not only is the governor taking the weapons of the militia in Nauvoo, but he's taking the weapons from the militias in all surrounding cities. Because remember, he's in Carthage to prevent a civil war in Hancock County. And this must have terrified Joseph and his friends there. Remember, Joseph, hearing that the Latter-day Saints near Warsaw were having their weapons stolen, was one of the factors that led him to declare martial law in Nauvoo. Joseph asks that at the very least he be allowed to return to Nauvoo with them to see that everything is done in order, that the guns are collected in order. Joseph's worried that if the Nauvoo Legion sees the men from Carthage there to take their weapons, that they might fight back, or that it would be difficult. Joseph feels that if he goes back with them, then the men won't feel as threatened, the men in the Nauvoo Legion. Well, at the same time that the Nauvoo Legion is giving their arms back to the state to be locked up inside some warehouse somewhere, the Warsaw militia is gathered to have their weapons collected, and they, like the Nauvoo Legion, are being disbanded as a military unit. Well, the citizens of Warsaw are not having it. They're rebelling. They're keeping their arms. They will not be kept weaponless. So you have the militiamen in Warsaw who have ignored Governor Ford's direction, and the Latter-day Saints are keeping Governor Ford's directions and are now turning in their weapons, and so you start to see this imbalance of power. The Latter-day Saints, like in Missouri, have given up their weapons and have put themselves at the mercy of the government. And to highlight this difference between Warsaw and Nauvoo, as Joseph is standing there watching the Nauvoo Legion file by and turn in their muskets, he sees a lot of them crying, a lot of them fighting back tears. And he says, maybe to Hiram next to him, quote, "These men are too good, too quiet and law-abiding for this rough generation," end quote. And Joseph then shouts out, quote, "Boys," which is what Joseph called the men in his militia, boys. He shouts out, quote, "Boys, don't be cast down. I will come back again as soon as I can," end quote. Well, later that night, as he was finally riding out of Nauvoo, he would tell the gathered Nauvoo Legion, a little more tempered this time, quote, "Boys, if I don't come back, take care of yourselves," end quote. Well, now, taking back these weapons has taken all day. And within the course of that day, Joseph has snuck back home 3 times to say goodbye to Emma and his kids. 3 times. That means 4 times during the day, Joseph has said goodbye to his family for what he probably felt was the last time. And while he was there, those last 3 times, he begged Emma to go with him to Carthage. But she was pregnant and had children to look after and insisted she could not go. Emma then asks her husband for a blessing. Now, a blessing in the restored Church of Jesus Christ is when someone with the priesthood lays their hands on another person's head and, as directed by the Holy Spirit, gives that person a revelation of comfort or guidance, or maybe gives them a promise of some sort. Joseph, however, tells Emma that he doesn't have time to give her a blessing right now. He asks her to write out a blessing on a piece of paper, and that when he gets back, he'll sign it. Well, almost 12 hours after Joseph originally started off for Carthage earlier in the morning, he finally heads off to Carthage again with the rest of his party. When they finally arrive in Carthage, it's dark. It's after 9 p.m. They ride up to the Hamilton House, which again is the hotel where everyone's staying. And in fact, at the same time that Joseph Smith is riding up to the outside of the hotel, inside are William Law and his business partners and the leaders of William's church and co-conspirators in Joseph's destruction. And they are now openly talking about killing Joseph, openly talking about his murder, not only amongst themselves, but with some of the other men who have been gathered to kill Joseph, who were never members of the church, men who they've met up with and become friends with through their common enemy. While outside, a large group of the local militia, who calls themselves the Carthage Greys, are standing outside waiting for Joseph's arrival, and they see this large group of men show up on horseback, and they start shouting, "Where's the damned prophet?" They're shouting, "Old Joe, we've got you now. You've seen the last of Nauvoo." They're hooting and hollering and throwing their muskets in the air so that they land down with their bayonets stuck in the ground like they're throwing a javelin. So this posse that was sent to escort Joseph into the city starts to push through this angry crowd of men, and all the noise and shouting causes a window to open up in the Hamilton House, and it's Governor Ford. He sticks his head out. He tells the men gathered below, quote, "It's quite too late tonight for you to have the opportunity to meet Joseph Smith. But I assure you, you will have that privilege tomorrow morning, gentlemen, before he is scheduled in court," end quote. And with that, the mob breaks out into chants of, "Hurrah for Tom Ford! Hurrah for Tom Ford!" It's the middle of the night on Monday, June 24th, 1844, and Joseph Smith and his friends go into the Hamilton House to sleep, like they're sleeping in a pit of vipers, surrounded by enemies. It's 3 days before Joseph is murdered. On the next episode of the podcast, the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.